Rain began to fall as Marcus Williams pulled out of the office parking lot. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, creating shimmering streaks like thousands of shattered mirrors. The clock on the dashboard read 9:30 p.m. It had been a long, exhausting day at the civil rights law firm where he worked. The demands of being a civil rights attorney required unwavering dedication, and Marcus knew that better than anyone. He turned on some soft jazz, hoping to relax his mind. His head ached from hours of debating a case involving a wrongfully accused client. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, checking for anything unusual. And then that all-too-familiar feeling crept in, the discomfort he had come to know too well. In the distance, red and blue lights began to flash. He sighed deeply. "Not again," he muttered. Marcus hadn't run a red light, hadn't been speeding, and his car had recently passed inspection. But he didn't need anyone to tell him the reason. Driving while black remained an unspoken justification for some officers to abuse their power. He pulled over to the side of the road, his heartbeat picking up slightly. Instinct told him to keep his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Clearly visible through the windshield, a silent shield of caution. Footsteps echoed on the wet pavement. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a tall officer in a crisp uniform approaching his car. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, momentarily blinding him. "License and registration," the officer said curtly, his tone devoid of friendliness or courtesy. "No, good evening." No explanation, just an order. Marcus took a deep breath. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I've been pulled over?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with quiet resolve. "You were driving too slowly," the officer replied, his gaze scrutinizing Marcus as if searching for any sign of guilt. "Too slowly," Marcus repeated, his surprise evident. "It's raining. I was just trying to drive carefully." The officer leaned closer to the window, rain dripping from the brim of his hat onto his jacket. "Carefully? Or are you hiding something?" he asked, the final word laced with a provocative undertone, as though daring Marcus to react. Marcus swallowed his frustration, reminding himself that losing his temper would only make things worse. He slowly reached for the glove compartment to retrieve his documents, every movement deliberate and measured. The officer snatched the papers from Marcus's hand without so much as a word of thanks. "Wait here," he commanded before turning and walking back to the patrol car. Marcus watched in the rearview mirror as the officer examined his paperwork in the patrol car. Time dragged heavily, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. Finally, the officer returned, but instead of handing back the documents, he spoke sharply. "Step out of the car." Marcus looked at him, his brow furrowing slightly. "For what reason, officer? I haven't done anything wrong." "Don't make me repeat myself," the officer snapped, his tone firm and commanding. Marcus had no choice but to open the door and step out into the cold rain, which immediately soaked through his jacket. He stood there, doing his best to stay calm, as the officer circled to the back of the car. "Open the trunk," the officer demanded. Marcus crossed his arms over his chest. "Officer, you need a warrant to do that." A mocking smile spread across the officer's face. "A warrant? I'm your warrant." Marcus kept his gaze steady, unwavering. "By law, you can't do this. I have the right to refuse." The officer didn't reply. Instead, he grabbed a set of keys from his belt and marched straight to the trunk, acting as though Marcus's words carried no weight at all. The trunk popped open with a sharp click. The officer shone his flashlight inside, the beam sweeping over every corner. His gaze stopped on a neatly placed gray suitcase in the corner. "What's this?" he asked, suspicion heavy in his tone. "Personal belongings," Marcus replied calmly, "and you have no right to touch them." But the officer ignored the warning. He opened the suitcase, pulling out the first document he saw. His eyes locked onto the bold letters at the top of the page. Notice of termination. His face turned pale. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, reading the details of allegations against him. racial discrimination, unlawful detainment, intimidation of civilians, and then, the detail that made his breath catch, his own name prominently displayed in the document. Marcus stood with his arms crossed, watching the officer's expression shift. "Something wrong, Officer Hendricks?" he asked, his voice cold and tinged with subtle mockery. The officer didn't respond. His eyes now shimmered with panic. "You've just violated my civil rights, searched my vehicle without a warrant, and are now holding documents from your new boss," Marcus said, enunciating the last words deliberately. "Welcome to the future, Officer Hendricks." The rain continued to fall, its rhythmic patter echoing on the ground. But in Hendricks's eyes, the world was unraveling. Officer James Hendricks stood frozen beside his patrol car, still clutching the document he had no right to touch. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with disbelief, as if struck by an undeniable truth he could no longer evade. The rain continued to fall, cold droplets soaking through his jacket, but the chill in his body paled in comparison to the shock coursing through his mind. Marcus remained leaning against his car, his gaze steady and unwavering. He didn't smile or mock, but his silence alone was enough to make Hendricks feel smaller than ever. What the hell is this?" Hendricks stammered, staring at the paper. He tried to steady his voice but failed miserably. "What is it?" Marcus replied coldly. "It's the official notice of your termination, signed by Chief Peterson, and I think you just demonstrated tonight exactly why it's justified." Hendricks was at a loss for words. The paper in his hands detailed years of misconduct, abuse of power, intimidation of civilians, and racial discrimination. It was not a short list, and the testimonies from victims were meticulously documented. One case after another. I don't believe this," Hendricks muttered, staring at the paper as though willing it to vanish. "You don't believe it?" Marcus cut in, stepping closer. "This isn't a joke, Officer Hendricks. This is the consequence of your actions. Did you really think you could keep getting away with it forever?" Hendricks took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Look," he began, his tone turning almost pleading. "This has to be some kind of misunderstanding. I'm not a bad guy. I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Marcus echoed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Searching my car without probable cause? Violating my civil rights? Is that what you call doing your job?" Hendricks felt as if everything around him was crumbling. He had always thought himself untouchable, believing the uniform and badge on his chest would shield him from any consequences. But now, the man standing before him wasn't just a civilian. Marcus was a civil rights attorney and, more importantly, the newly appointed legal advisor to the city's police department. "Listen," Marcus said, his voice calm but commanding. "I'm not here to negotiate. You have the right to defend yourself. But not with me. The days of you escaping accountability are over. You don't understand," Hendricks stammered, his voice trembling. "I have a family. I need this job. This will ruin my life." Marcus crossed his arms, his gaze steady and devoid of sympathy. "Your family deserves to know the truth about what you do every day in that uniform. As for your job, you destroyed it yourself. This isn't my fault. This is the result of your choices." Hendricks remained silent. The rain fell harder now, and his heavy breathing mingled with the sound of the downpour, like an unspoken confession. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed Chief Peterson's number. Even though it was late, he knew Peterson would take the call immediately. On the other end, a deep, firm voice answered. "This is Peterson." "Hello, Peterson. This is Marcus Williams," Marcus said, his tone clear and steady. "I'm at the scene with Officer Hendricks. I think you'll want to hear this tonight." He abused his authority again, but this time, he targeted the wrong person. There was a pause on the line before Peterson sighed heavily. "What happened?" Marcus detailed everything, from the unwarranted traffic stop to Hendricks's illegal search of his suitcase. He ended by emphasizing that the termination notice Hendricks discovered wasn't just evidence of his misconduct, but a reminder that the department's reform was officially underway. Understood, Peterson replied. His voice weighted with seriousness. I'll handle this immediately. Hendricks will no longer have a place in our ranks. Marcus nodded, even though Peterson couldn't see him. Good. I expect to see real action, not just words. The call ended, and Marcus turned to face Hendricks. The officer now looked like a man completely drained of life. He stood there, arms hanging limply at his sides, his eyes vacant and unfocused. You heard it, Marcus said. The department will be contacting you soon to handle this. You'd best prepare for your last day. Hendricks didn't respond, remaining frozen in place as if unable to comprehend what was happening. As for Marcus, he knew this was only the beginning. Reforming the police department wouldn't be easy, and Hendricks was just one of many who needed to be held accountable. But tonight, Marcus had proven that abuse of power wasn't untouchable. More importantly, he had sent a powerful message. Justice would prevail, no matter the odds. Under the cold rain, Marcus climbed back into his car, leaving Hendricks alone to face the truth. He started the engine and drove off, but he knew the story was far from over. A long fight lay ahead. The next morning, James Hendricks walked into the police station like a completely different man. Gone was the smug smile. Gone was the confident stride. Instead, he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The colleagues who had once seen him as untouchable now looked at him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Before Hendricks could sit at his desk, Chief Peterson appeared. His eyes were stern, his jaw set, an unmistakable signal that he had no patience for excuses. My office. Now, Peterson said. He didn't need to raise his voice. The command was enough to silence the entire room. Hendricks trudged behind him. Peterson's office wasn't large, but the oak desk and array of medals on the wall gave it an air of authority. Peterson sat down, placing his hands on a thick folder with Hendricks's name printed on the cover. Do you know what this is? Peterson asked, his deep voice calm but firm. Tapping the folder lightly, Hendricks hesitated. I didn't think this needed to go this far. I was just doing my job. Your job? Peterson's tone sharpened. Pulling people over without cause, conducting illegal searches. And now this, a file full of complaints about your abuse of power. Is that how you plan to defend yourself? Listen, I was just trying to keep things under control. Hendricks stammered. I didn't think it was that serious. Didn't think. Peterson shot back, locking eyes with him. How long have you been doing this without anyone questioning you? Well, now things have changed. Let me make one thing clear. There's no second chance for you. Within hours of the conversation between Marcus and Peterson, news of the incident began to spread. A social media post shared by Marcus quickly gained traction, drawing attention from thousands. The post was simple yet powerful. A police officer abused his power, but last night, justice spoke. This is only the beginning. The post was shared widely, and civil rights organizations quickly mobilized. They demanded the police department release all information regarding Hendricks's conduct and commit to a thorough investigation into systemic abuses of power within the force. On social media, past victims of Hendricks began to come forward with their own stories. One woman recounted how Hendricks had intimidated her simply for asking why she'd been pulled over. Another man shared that Hendricks had smashed his phone when he tried to record their encounter. These stories piled up, fueling a wave of outrage. Citizens flocked to City Hall to protest, demanding justice for the victims of police misconduct. The mounting pressure from the community forced the police department to issue an official statement. That day, in a packed conference room filled with reporters and activists, Peterson stepped up to the podium, his face tense. He knew every word he spoke would be scrutinized, and every sentence would determine whether he could maintain the trust of the community. Ladies and gentlemen, Peterson began. I want to extend my sincere apologies to the individuals affected by misconduct within our force. What has happened is unacceptable, and we will not tolerate any behavior that goes against the core values of this police department. A reporter stood up, raising their hand. What are you going to do to ensure this doesn't happen again? Peterson paused for a moment before responding. We have initiated a comprehensive internal investigation. Additionally, I have appointed Marcus Williams, a civil rights attorney, as the legal advisor to this department. With his guidance, we will review and reform our procedures, from recruitment to training. Standing quietly in the corner of the room, Marcus observed the scene. He knew Peterson's words were just the beginning. The real work would begin when the cameras were off and the spotlight faded. Meanwhile, Hendricks could no longer escape reality. He received an official notice of his suspension from duty. Worse, civil rights organizations had filed lawsuits against him on behalf of the victims he had harassed. At home, Hendricks sat numbly in front of the television, which was broadcasting news about him. His family, his wife and 2 young children, sat quietly in the corner of the room, unsure of what to say. Friends and former colleagues now avoided him as if he were a contagious disease. His phone rang, but it wasn't a call of sympathy. A former colleague was on the line, offering only a terse remark, "You'd better leave town before things get worse." Hendricks hung up, bitterness swelling in his chest. He had no idea what to do next. The career he had spent a lifetime building had crumbled overnight. Yet Hendricks also understood this wasn't just about him. It was about a system he had once trusted, now turning its back on him. For now, he had no choice but to prepare for the legal battles ahead. But deep down, he knew no lawyer could erase the damage he had done. With Marcus and the community rising to demand justice, Hendricks had become a symbol of a system in desperate need of reform. And he was confronted with a bitter truth. No one is above the law, not even those who once thought they could bend it to their will. The case of James Hendricks was no longer an isolated incident. After Marcus Williams publicly shared the story, other victims of police misconduct began to come forward. Social media posts, interviews with the press, and even videos documenting Hendricks's past abuses sent shockwaves through the public. Each account served as undeniable evidence of a system that had enabled and protected officers like him for years. The city's police department quickly felt the pressure, not just from the local community but also from national organizations. Civil rights activists demanded full disclosure of complaint records against the police force, forcing the department to commit to greater transparency in handling allegations of misconduct. This sparked a chain reaction. Hendricks wasn't the only one under scrutiny. Other officers were also dragged into the spotlight. New names began surfacing in public discussions, each tied to a list of reprehensible actions. The old system, designed to shield those within it, was now being shaken to its core. Marcus wasn't on the sidelines. He organized press conferences, partnered with legal organizations, and pushed for a comprehensive investigation. He knew that addressing Hendricks's actions was only the first step in a long journey toward systemic reform. "We're not just dealing with one bad apple," Marcus said during a speech at City Hall. "We have to take a hard look at the entire barrel." Under Chief Peterson's leadership, the police department began reopening old complaints that had previously been dismissed or ignored. Files once buried in bureaucracy were now being reviewed, each line a bitter reminder of the system's failures. Officers like Hendricks, who were once deemed untouchable, were now being summoned to answer for their actions. Peterson and Marcus worked together to establish a special investigative team, including civil rights attorneys, psychologists, and experts in systemic reform. Their goal wasn't just to uncover the truth, but to recommend fundamental changes to the department's structure and practices. "People often say the police force is like a family," Marcus said during a meeting with the investigative team. "But a real family doesn't tolerate misconduct. A real family holds each other accountable." The team uncovered that the current training system was inadequate in addressing implicit racial bias. Programs focused heavily on combat skills rather than fostering relationships with the community. The internal complaint process was also criticized for being overly complex and opaque, leaving victims feeling unheard and powerless. Marcus knew that change would not come easily. Some officers, even those not directly implicated in misconduct, began to feel the pressure and resisted the reforms. They viewed the changes as personal attacks. But Marcus stood firm. He understood that reform wasn't just about removing bad actors, it was about rebuilding trust on both sides, between the police force and the community. During the ongoing investigation, James Hendricks attempted to salvage his reputation. He agreed to a televised interview to clarify what had happened. On air, he appeared regretful, but his apology failed to convince anyone. "I made mistakes," Hendricks said in a hoarse voice, "but I don't believe I'm a bad person. I was just doing what I thought was necessary to protect the community." His words were met with immediate backlash. Many accused him of trying to justify his actions rather than truly taking responsibility. When Marcus was asked about the interview, he responded succinctly, "An apology means nothing without action." In an unexpected move, a group of Hendricks's victims organized their own press conference to respond to his apology. Kevin, a man who had been unlawfully detained by Hendricks, addressed the crowd. "Hendricks wasn't just a law enforcement officer. He was a nightmare for me and so many others. His apology doesn't erase the trauma we've endured." The mounting pressure from the community forced Hendricks to abandon his efforts to defend himself. He became isolated, not only professionally but also in his personal life. Finally, after weeks of investigation, the police department officially announced the termination of James Hendricks. In addition to losing his position, Hendricks faced multiple lawsuits from his victims, including criminal charges related to abuse of power. Hendricks made his final appearance at the station to turn in his badge and gun. It was a bitter moment. Colleagues who had once respected him now avoided him, and he knew he no longer had a place in the force. As for Marcus, he continued his work with unwavering resolve. He didn't view Hendricks's dismissal as a personal victory, but as the beginning of a much longer journey. At a press conference following the announcement, he emphasized, "Justice isn't just about punishing those who've done wrong. Justice is about building a system where everyone, regardless of race or status, can feel safe and protected." The police department began implementing new reforms. A revamped training program focused on anti-discrimination and community engagement was introduced. The complaint process was overhauled to ensure transparency, with oversight from an independent review board. While significant progress was made, Marcus knew the work was far from over. Yet, seeing the hopeful faces of victims who had finally found their voices, he felt reassured. And he knew that, no matter how challenging the journey, justice would always be the guiding light. Marcus Williams stood before a packed auditorium filled with local residents. This was the first community workshop he had organized since the James Hendricks case became public. The faces before him represented a diverse mix of ages, races, and socioeconomic backgrounds, but they all shared a common goal: building a fairer and safer community. "We've uncovered the truth," Marcus began, his voice strong and clear. "But exposing the truth is just the first step. If we want change, each of us must take action." The workshop lasted for hours, covering topics ranging from recognizing police misconduct to protecting civil rights in tense situations. Marcus invited other civil rights attorneys and social activists to share their expertise and practical skills. The highlight of the event was a story shared by a young woman named Lila. She recounted a time when a police officer had threatened her for attempting to film an arrest. "I felt powerless," Lila said, her eyes welling with tears. "But tonight, I realize I'm not alone. We all have power, and when we stand together, that power cannot be ignored." Marcus took the stage again after Lila's emotional testimony. He emphasized, "Stories like Lila's are what will change the world. By uniting and supporting one another, we don't just build a better community, we create the pressure needed to hold systems of power accountable." The workshop concluded with a concrete action plan. establishing a community oversight group to monitor cases of misconduct, and creating a legal fund to support those affected. A few weeks later, Marcus began collaborating with nonprofit organizations to launch a new initiative in local schools. The program, called Generation Citizen, focused on educating teenagers about civil rights, equality, and how to drive social change. During a session at Roosevelt High School, Marcus stood before a classroom full of students. "How many of you have ever felt like you don't have a voice?" he asked. A few hesitant hands went up, while others looked at him with curiosity. "That has to change," Marcus said, pacing slowly through the rows of desks. "You don't just have a voice, you have rights. And those rights must be protected, no matter who you are, where you're from, or what you look like." The lesson wasn't just theoretical. Marcus and a team of volunteers organized hands-on workshops where students practiced how to respond in high-pressure situations, such as being pulled over by the police or facing discrimination. They were taught how to safely document incidents, request legal assistance, and, most importantly, stand up with confidence rather than being overwhelmed by fear. After the session, a 16-year-old student named Jamal approached Marcus. "Mr. Marcus, I used to think there was nothing I could do to make a difference," he said, his eyes shining. "But now I want to be like you, someone who's not afraid to stand up for the truth." Marcus smiled, feeling his heart swell with warmth. This was exactly why he had started this journey, not just to change the present but to plant seeds of hope for the future. Meanwhile, James Hendricks, once the focal point of public outrage, was living a completely different life. Stripped of his police uniform and authority, he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. Hendricks moved out of the city to a small apartment in a quiet town. In the early days after his dismissal, he rarely left his home, avoiding the judgmental stares of those around him. But the isolation only lasted so long. Hendricks eventually began attending therapy sessions and support programs designed for individuals seeking personal change. One day, Hendricks decided to do something he never thought he would. He reached out to Marcus. The phone call was brief but meaningful. "I don't expect your forgiveness," Hendricks said, "but I want to know if there's anything I can do to make things right." Marcus was silent for a moment before replying. "Listen to the people you've hurt, and if you're truly committed to change, start by helping the community you once ignored." Hendricks joined a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting victims of police misconduct. At first, he was met with coldness and skepticism, but over time, his sincerity began to be recognized. He spent hours listening to people's stories, assisting those in need of legal guidance, and even participating in workshops where he shared his journey of accountability and redemption. A few months later, the city's police department held an important press conference. Peterson and Marcus stood side by side on the stage, announcing major systemic changes. From now on, all new officers would be required to undergo training in civil rights and anti-discrimination. An independent oversight board had been established to handle complaints, ensuring that no one could evade accountability. The press conference concluded with a powerful message from Marcus. "We've seen what happens when power goes unchecked. But today, we prove that justice isn't just an ideal, it's action, it's change, and it's hope for a better tomorrow." As Marcus stepped off the stage, he felt a deep sense of pride. The journey was far from over, but he knew his efforts were beginning to make a difference. On his way home, he passed by a group of kids playing basketball on the sidewalk, their laughter ringing out in the cool evening air. He smiled, realizing that the future was being built, one step at a time, and in that future, fairness and compassion would be the foundation.